Thanks for tuning in again to the troubleshooting series about this Monstera and its brown tips. Okay, so we've got an action-packed episode this week. First up, I'm going to be giving you a quick overview of how the Monstera is going, and I've got some exciting news to share in that regard. We're also going to be removing the yellow leaves and the brown tips from this Monstera so that we can keep it healthy. And as I indicated in the last episode, the bigger task is we're going to be unstaking this Monstera, treating the moss pole for mold, and then restaking it back. So as you can see, there's plenty to do. So let's get our hands dirty. This Monstera is travelling along nicely. The leaves are looking happy, and this Monstera is happily growing alongside this moss pole. You can see this yellow leaf that we identified in the last episode has continued to deteriorate. So we'll be removing this one. We'll also be removing this small immature leaf here, which originally had a brown tip as well. But there is one development which I'm so excited to see and share with you. You may have already noticed, but this Monstera is shooting out new growth. If you can see. And it's not only this one that's developed new growth. You can actually see here, there's new growth coming from this stem. And if I swivel the plant around, this one's a bit harder to see, but I can actually see the new sheath coming out here. So it's actually good fortune that we're going to be restaking this moss pole, because it'll give us a better chance to position the new growth so that it doesn't get pinned into the moss pole. And hopefully now that it's had time to readjust itself, we can reposition the stems so that we can get better contact with the aerial roots. So I'm really stoked with how this Monstera is going. One other thing I wanted to quickly point out to you, you can actually see there's a little plant growing out the side here. And it looks like to me that this is actually a pumpkin plant. And you may be asking yourself, how on earth did a pumpkin seed get into this Monstera? Actually, this is quite a common occurrence for my plants, because I like to use homemade organic worm castings. It's inevitable that seeds get transferred in the mix, so this isn't actually the first pumpkin seedling that I've found in my pot plants. Some plant parents may find this annoying. I actually don't mind. It just tells me that I've got rich, fertile soil, so it's simply a matter of just plucking it out so that it doesn't take away from the nutrients. There you go. Now, it's not the season for pumpkin seeds to be growing, so unfortunately this guy's just going to go into the compost heap, but you can see it's quite happily growing in this pot. Okay, let's get stuck into removing the yellow leaves. So when it comes to removing leaves from your indoor plants, there's always the temptation to just kind of pull it out. Now, we don't recommend doing that, because even though it might seem easier and more convenient, it can actually cause more damage to the plant by tearing healthy tissue away and leaving an open wound. So whenever we need to remove parts of a plant, we always use sharp sterilized scissors. And the sterilization is the important part, because we don't want to be spreading diseases between our plants. So to sterilize our gardening equipment, we always use rubbing alcohol. And you can find these easily from your local nursery or online in places like Amazon. And I'll put a link in the description below. And sterilizing is really not that difficult. So to sterilize our equipment, simply dab a bit of rubbing alcohol on a clean tissue and wipe down your equipment. Now, because it's high concentration alcohol, it will evaporate quite quickly. And we're simply going to go in, remove the leaves as close to the base as possible. So by removing leaves that have damage or are yellow or have some brown tips, like this one, we're actually assisting our Monstera to focus all its energy on new growth and the healthy parts of the plant. So we're actually going to be cutting off this brown part on this healthy looking leaf. And the reason why we're not going to be taking this whole leaf off, it's actually still quite healthy and vibrant. If this leaf was yellowing as well, I'd probably remove it. But because there's no evidence of that, I'm simply going to be removing the brown tip. All you have to do is simply cut a decent way into the healthy portion of the leaf, just so that it'll give this a chance to callus over nice and cleanly. And there you go. The brown tip has been removed. And I've cut it on a curve, just so it looks nice and natural. Okay, so let's now turn our attention to the main part of this episode, and that's dealing with the mold problem on our moss pole. Now the good news is, because I haven't moistened the moss pole since we staked the Monstera to it, the mold has stopped growing and has had a notable decrease in its presence on the moss pole. But the more I think about it, the more I'm inclined to treating the moss pole with a hydrogen peroxide solution. And that's because the whole purpose of this moss pole was to create humidity for the Monstera. I also included it there to act as a secondary water source for the aerial roots to attach itself and draw water from. So by keeping the moss pole dry, it's actually defeated the whole purpose of having this Monstera staked to this moss pole. And like I pointed out earlier in the video, by unstaking the Monstera and then reattaching it, it'll give me an opportunity to maneuver the stems into a better position. So let's get started. Now, unstaking a Monstera is relatively straightforward, especially because we use these Velcro plant ties. Okay, as you can see, the Monstera has actually been quite stubborn and is staying quite close to the moss pole. So what I'm going to do as an extra precaution is I'm going to line the Monstera with some paper towel from the kitchen. And this will just act as a bit of a barrier to protect the Monstera from the hydrogen peroxide solution. Okay, so I'll admit it's a bit of a hack job, but I think it'll do a lot actually by preventing any accidental spray going onto the Monstera. So to make up the hydrogen peroxide solution, I used a parts system. So I used a 1:3 dilution ratio, and that's simply because I'm going to be spraying it onto sphagnum moss and I don't want to damage the sphagnum moss tissue. So I wanted a weaker solution rather than a stronger solution. And to make up the hydrogen peroxide solution, and that was simply to mix 1 part hydrogen peroxide 3% solution with 3 parts distilled water, and simply putting it into a spray bottle and making sure it's mixed around thoroughly. So all we need to do now is spray the moldy parts of the moss pole and make sure to spray a perimeter around it because mold spores can spread by air. So we want to make sure we kill all the mold spores so that we don't get any recurrence of this later down the track. Okay, so I've just finished treating the moss pole with the hydrogen peroxide solution, but because we've just set this moss pole up with this Monstera, I'm reluctant to disturb it too much. So what I'm simply going to do is allow this to dry completely before reattaching the Monstera. Now you might be thinking that it's really important to wash the chemicals away from the moss, but in the end hydrogen peroxide will just turn into water and oxygen, which is why I'm allowing it to completely dry. So I'm going to have to come back to you once this is finished drying, and then we can restake this Monstera. Okay, so it's been 1.5 days since we've soaked this sphagnum moss pole with hydrogen peroxide, and I have to say the results are actually quite good. As you can see, there aren't any mold patches on this moss pole anymore, and it's completely dry. So now it's ready to restake the Monstera back onto this moss pole and get it back to where it was before. Now if you've been following along in this troubleshooting series, you know that I had a bit of difficulty staking it last time to get the aerial roots in contact with the moss. So what I thought I might try and do is try and angle the stems a bit more so that we can get the aerial roots attached to this moss pole. Let's give it a shot. Okay, there you have it. I've successfully reattached the Monstera to the moss pole, and I'm actually really happy with how it's worked out. So in the end, what I've actually been able to achieve is wrapping this stem around the moss pole. So I already have an aerial root right here attached to the moss pole already. And my hope is that this aerial root will actually grow into the moss more, because now I'll be able to keep this moss damp because there's no more mold spores on it. And if I rotate the plant, you'll be able to see I attached this left stem up and the new leaf is going to come out here. And on the other side, I've attached this stem here with the new leaf coming out here. So I've actually been able to achieve quite a nice form for this Monstera now. And actually, just judging by the feel of the weight of this Monstera, it's actually quite light, so it definitely needs a bit more water in it. And I'll just test the soil. Yeah, definitely dry. So the next steps I'm going to take is re-moistening this moss pole thoroughly, fill up the water reservoir in this self-watering moss pole, and I'll also bottom water this Monstera so that the main root ball will get plenty of moisture as well. So there you have it. We've treated the moss pole for mold, we've restaked the Monstera, and now it's simply a matter of waiting and seeing how this Monstera responds. Thanks again for tuning into this tutorial. If you have any questions about our troubleshooting series, feel free to drop a comment below. Otherwise, we have a whole heap of helpful articles on our Garden Benchtop website, so jump on over there and join the conversations happening around the Garden Benchtop. Now, you may or may not know, but we also have a Garden Benchtop community called The Bench, and that's an exclusive community of plant parents, all helping and supporting each other along the plant parenting journey. It's free to join, so I'll leave a link in the description below, but jump on over there, join the community, and feel free to ask any questions you have. As we always say at the Garden Benchtop, go get your hands dirty. See ya!